Corporate fraud works best in the shadows, behind corporate walls. How does the government bring these wrongdoers to justice? Whistleblowers. These are the stories of those who risk their careers to shine a light on allegations of fraud. Today on Fraud in America.
Welcome to today's episode of Fraud in America. Today we have a very special guest. We're meeting with Frances Haugen. She is an American data scientist, an algorithmic product manager, we'll find out what that is, and a whistleblower. She's a graduate of Franklin W. Olin College of Engineering and the Harvard Business School. She worked at, listen to this lineup, Google, Yelp, and Pinterest before joining Facebook, now known as Meta, in 2019. She worked in the Civil Integrity Department along with a couple other departments. And then in 2021, she disclosed tens of thousands of pages of internal documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Wall Street Journal, revealing Facebook's awareness of and complicity in radicalization and political violence around the world. That's the thumbnail biography on the back of her soon-to-be New York Times bestselling book, The Power of One, How I Found the Strength to Tell the Truth and Why I Blew the Whistle on Facebook. We're going to dive into her book and her story. Thank you so much, Frances.
Happy to be here.
So I'm going to start off with I'm going to read a part from your book that I think summarizes your concerns. And we'll get in, maybe translate what some of this stuff means for people who don't have a science background or think that algorithmic has something to do with Al Gore. So previously, the Facebook news feed had been configured to optimize for how much time you spent on Facebook. Now, after a change in the algorithm, it would be reconfigured to give the most distribution to content that provoked the most interactions. Overnight, the content creation rates were turned around. Give people more comments and thumbs up, and they'll give Facebook more free content to sell ads against. Yet, within 6 months, the Civil Integrity team discovered that new content wasn't exactly free. Facebook just wasn't the one paying for it. Democracy was paying the price, society was paying the price, civil discourse was paying the price. In some areas of the world, people were paying the price with their lives. So, what is an algorithm, and why is that so important when it comes to social media?
Sure. One of the things that isn't obvious to people is when we say, I use Facebook.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of us are anchored in an expectation of what that is from when we first started using it back in the 2000s. Back then, we saw things in basically the order in which our friends produced them, right? Like, it was more like an email inbox, where like your email, you know, the most recent emails are at the top and it keeps going down. At some point, Facebook realized your friends and family make a certain amount of content on any given day. You know, the reality is, unless you have a very, very active friend network in terms of posting, you're gonna have, you know, probably run out of content if you like using Facebook. And people were okay with that. It used to be you knew when it ended, when to stop. Mm-hmm. You knew when to log off. But Facebook realized if instead of having your friends basically pick what you see, if they could pull from like a much larger pool of content, they could just keep you on there for longer and longer. And so they invented a little computer program that said, hey, how do we pick from this giant pool of content? So, you know, when you open your phone, there's probably 100,000 or 1 million pieces of content, you know, a post, a video, whatever, that they could show you. Maybe this is stuff that, you know, your friend didn't create, but they commented on. You know, maybe this is something from a group you joined or a group you were invited to, and for 30 days, Facebook treated that like a join. All that content, they have to decide, what's the first thing I'm going to show you? And that process of picking out, okay, I'm going to show you this first, I'm going to show you this second, I'm going to show you this third, that is an algorithm.
Got it. And this change that happened, it used to be to encourage you to stay on so you can see grandmama's biscuits you took a picture of. It's now showing you other things that are outside your family. Is that right?
So the transition, like the reason why they moved from saying, let's just let your friends pick what you're going to see, to let's figure out a way that we could grow the pool of what you might want to look at. That was done so they could keep you on there longer.
Okay.
The change that you talk about, from the excerpt from my book, talks about, Facebook has to decide every time they change that process, because that process of picking what goes first, second, third, fourth, is actually very, very complicated. It's going to be thousands and thousands of lines of computer code, taking into consideration all kinds of different factors. If we're trying to say this version of the algorithm is better than that one, we need to have something called a goal function. We need to be able to say, hey, if this version keeps you on the platform for longer, it's better. Or in the case of the change, they said, hey, we need people to interact more. Because when you get more interaction, you make more content. They switched over and said, that's how we're going to assess A or B.
Got it. So there's been a lot of talk about Facebook and other social media platforms being a closed company or an opaque company. I think that's the language that you use. What do you mean by that?
So for, basically the history of the Industrial Revolution, right? So for the last 300 years, we have been living in a world where as the economy got more complicated as it grew, it produced products that we could inspect ourselves, right? Like if you buy a car, even if you don't know anything about cars today, you can buy books, you can go on the internet, people will explain to you, how do I take apart this car? How do I fix this car? If you look at Facebook, there is almost nothing you can do to actually understand the inner workings of what's happening on the platform. And I'll give you an example of just how the world has changed in even the last 20 years. So we're not even talking about, a 1950s automobile. When we look at something like Google, because everyone who uses Google gets basically the same version. There's some tweaks for things like if you search for a zoo in San Diego and a zoo in Seattle, they'll show you the Seattle Zoo or the San Diego Zoo first. But for overall, we basically see the same things. And that means, I know this is going to sound like a reach, if you and I sat down for 3 weeks and you let me teach you some programming, you could meaningfully ask questions about how does Google work? Like what does it show, what does it not show? Are there biases, that kind of thing? Because we all see the same thing. If we wanted to do that same accountability 101 for Facebook, we would have to recruit 20,000 people, convince them to put apps on their phones or on their computers to monitor like what they were seeing, because every single one of them sees a different thing. Like it's orders of magnitude more difficult to do even basic accountability. That's an opaque system.
So why is that black box concerning when it comes to like Facebook?
Sure. So we need to remember Facebook is a for-profit company, right? Like one thing I'm always grounded in is I try not to demonize Facebook. I try to say Facebook is a company working within a system of incentives, and the behavior we see is consistent with that kind of, those constraints. In the case of Facebook, every time they're choosing this version of the algorithm, we could be assessing, is this good or bad on a lot of different dimensions. We could say things like, are people going to bed when they want to go to bed? Are kids getting shown more or less dangerous content? Is it making more ad money? Is it creating more engagement? There's a lot of different ways we could assess that. And right now, we are left with having to just trust them that the optimizations they're making are good for society. It's kind of like if we were making that car, right? Imagine a world where we couldn't measure air pollution outside the factory. If the company was trying to decide, we have this industrial process or this one, but this one creates a lot of toxic air pollution. Imagine if we couldn't know that trade-off had even taken place. And that's what's happening inside of companies like Facebook or any other company where the product is on a data center. It's on a chip. Those companies are opaque to our ability to assess them. And I guarantee you, those little agonizing trade-offs are happening every day. And we have to just trust that their better angels are saying, no, we're going to turn down that profit. We're going to turn down those expenses.
You have a line in the book that I love, that we were relying on big tech to grade their own homework.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That really struck with me. We're going to get to some more of your concerns and the allegations that are laid out in your book, but I'd love to take people back.
Sure.
I love your backstory. You grew up in Iowa. Iowa City, attending a public elementary school.
And public high school.
In public high school. You are the daughter of two professors? One professor?
Two professors.
Two professors.
And the great-granddaughter of a dean. Yeah.
So academics was very important to you growing up, or at least to your family, I imagine.
My parents never put pressure on us to go into academics, but it was a household, like our house had at least 5,000 books in it, right? Like every single room except the laundry room, which was maybe like 4 feet by 4 feet or 6 feet by 6 feet, had books in it, including bathrooms, right? Just because my parents didn't know like where to stash them. And so it's just a different environment.
And did you grow up in the sciences and math? Thinking about where you ended up, I would think that you had a dry erase board at the kitchen table.
It's so interesting. So I would say like early on, I was exposed a lot to. So my parents love to garden, so I grew a lot of food. Like I love growing plants. And it's funny. There's like I look back on my college years, and there's this like singular moment where like I feel like the course of my life veered, which was I was taking biology because we had to, it was a requirement. Yeah. And I was talking to my professor, and I was like, God, like, I've kind of thought about like, what if I got like a botany PhD? Because like my mom was a botany minor, right? One of her majors in college was botany. Yeah. And my professor said, everything interesting in botany got resolved in the 70s, which is not true.
Right.
But like, I'm a naive 19-year-old. Like, I don't know if that's true or not. Yeah. And I sometimes wonder, like, God, how different would my life have been? I'd be like, hey, I could grow plants every day and like see where they go. But no, so that was kind of, I think gardening and growing plants is a great way to expose kids to the idea that your actions can have consequences, right? Because like I had a plot of ground, and if I worked that ground, if I tilled it before we planted, I got a different outcome than if I had not done that, right? And my brother and I had very different attitudes on like how we cultivated our own spaces, right? And I really liked like building toys, right? So like my parents had an attitude of they wouldn't buy me toys except for like Christmas or birthdays. I could save my allowance, but if I wanted basically anything from the hardware store, they would give me the thing from the hardware store.
Gotcha.
And so we would build stuff out of PVC pipes, or they take me to the arts and crafts store. I built elaborate doll houses, that kind of thing. And so I came into high school thinking I want to go to MIT. Mm-hmm. That was kind of my goal. And I joined debate because they always tell you like you need to be well-rounded. Like if you're just like a math and science person, it's actually harder to get into some of the more prestigious things. And the thing that I found so funny was by the time I left high school, I had learned enough more about the world that I didn't want to go to a place like MIT. Like I really wanted to go to like Yale.
Yes.
And I didn't get any assistance in applying to college. So like my parents are sufficiently hands-off that like no one sat me down and was like, hey, you are most likely to get in if you fill out the forms this way.
Yes.
And as a result, I got into MIT, Caltech, and Olin.
Yes.
And so now imagine you're this like 18-year-old and you're like, I totally get why I was accepted to these schools. Like this was actually what I set out to do when I was 14. But I really want to go be a poli-sci major or something. And so
this is the part I find fascinating. Yeah. So you decided to go into debate to round out your application.
So I could get into this technical school,
But you seem to fall in love with debate. I mean, you taught
really
debate in college too, right? To local high schools. Yeah. So you fell in love with debate.
This is again one of these things where like if you want to get into a good graduate program, you need community service, that kind of thing. And I love teaching.
Yeah.
Right. I love helping people wrestle with issues that are meaningful to them.
Right.
And coaching high school debate is really fun because smart high schoolers have a lot of emotions, right? Like they can understand enough of the world. They feel conflicted. They might feel agonized. And like one of the things that if we can get certain building blocks around like reasonable guardrails on social media in place, like I would love to work with high schoolers on like how do we live with a digital world? Yes. Like what is a scaled intervention with high schoolers and junior high kids for a world where we've actually lost a lot of social capital, like a lot of skills about in-person connection because these kids have been online since they were 8. Right. And so that's kind of like one of my dreams once we get like the legal pieces kind of like squared away.
Love it.
Yeah.
So I love your book for many reasons, but I like that throughout your story you say, by the way, this helped me later on when I became a whistleblower.
Yeah.
Like you did that throughout the book, which I love. And when I hear whistleblower stories, I can't help but do that myself. Like, oh, I see the seeds here. What became?
Well, part of why I put all the debate stuff was
Yeah.
so my husband loves conspiracy theories.
Uh-huh.
So like in terms of how we interact with the internet, I'm not saying he believes them, but he loves them as like cultural artifacts.
Yes.
Right, because they tell you like what are people's fears or how they view the world, and he like the thing that drove me crazy when after my Senate testimony was there was a large number of people online who said she couldn't be that good.
Right.
Or she must be a government plant because there's no way she could be that good, right? Or
an engineer who can put a sentence together, right?
Yeah. And so part of why I include all the debate stuff is like my coach in high school, he became the head of the National Debate Association.
Yeah.
Right, like he was that good. Or like I was the C debater, right? They're like the top ranked person in the country, the second ranked person in the country. We're both on my team.
Yeah.
And so I never thought I was like that good at these things because compared to them,
Right.
Yeah.
So you got into MIT,
Yeah.
Caltech, and Olin.
Mm-hmm.
Olin at that time was not yet accredited.
No, I was the first class.
You were the first class,
Yeah.
30-something freshmen.
We had 75.
75 total.
So there were 30 that did an experimental year before us, and then altogether we made 75 for our freshman year.
So to me, that says
Yeah.
entrepreneur. We're like, I'm going to take a chance on them, and
Yeah.
they're going to take a chance on me. Why did you pick Olin?
So
Right?
it's interesting. Like I think a lot of people look at me and they say like you have a really high risk tolerance.
Yeah.
And like the thing that I'm always shocked when people say that because like I'm someone who builds like little risk waterfalls where it's like what does it mean to actually make this choice?
Yeah.
And for me, I skipped a grade in junior high,
Right.
so I knew I was already young, and I was like, I got into these other places once. I'm not going to be less interesting if I go do this for a year.
Very true.
Like, why not go take this experiment? Right? And so I viewed it as like not very risky because I was like, if it's interesting, it's going to be really cool. And if it's like a dud, whatever, it's like my gap year.
Yes. Fascinating. So Olin College of Engineering in Massachusetts, very well respected engineering school. Today, maybe
Yeah.
not back then. Tell me about your experience there.
So
It's a different curriculum than
it's a very different
the other
so,
schools.
so for context for people who have never heard of Olin,
Yeah.
Olin is what's sometimes known as like a lab school. So it exists to develop new ways to teach engineering. And they actively coach other engineering programs on like, here's other ways you can get higher performance, more participation out of your students. Because for context, back in the early 90s, the National Science Foundation came out and said, hey, like, we have a method for teaching engineering that was established in like the 40s and 50s. Right? It was like, we're gonna have this giant military industrial complex and engineers need to slot into their desk in a 5,000 person military industrial complex contractor and like make their widget really well.
Yeah.
Right? We're about to move into a world where the Cold War's over. Like we're gonna need engineers to go out into the world and like listen to people and understand their problems and then go solve those problems with engineering and then actually bring things to market. Like that's a very different set of skills than you're going to sit at your desk, you're going to be happy with it, and you're going to like contribute to the machine. And 2000 rolled around, so 8 years later, and nothing had changed, right? Because there's institutional inertia, right? Like coming in and saying, hey, we have to rethink how we do this is a really hard question. And the Olin Foundation, which at that point had given, I think on the order of like 70 or 80 buildings, like large engineering buildings and science buildings to universities around the country, noticed that even though they framed these gifts as transformational, they were starting to give second buildings to college campuses. So if this was meant to be transformational, like why am I giving you another building, right? And so they decided instead of continuing to do this, they were going to make a terminal gift and found a college. And so Olin College of Engineering ended up being that terminal gift. So they came in and said, let's actually try to change how engineering is taught. And so Olin put a much larger emphasis on the humanities. It put a much larger emphasis on design, like all the skills around if I was going to sit down with you and talk to you about your problems, how would I elicit from you, like actually being able to like communication isn't just about being able to hear, it's about can I make you feel safe enough you can talk?
Yes.
And can we see each other eye to eye kind of thing? How do you teach people those skills? And I'm extremely grateful I got that experience because it meant that I came into the world with, for example, a lot more history classes. Like I effectively minored in Cold War studies, right? Because I really like history. I like the intersection of like history and technology in that space. Yeah. I took a bunch of design classes, so I was good at seeing like understand people's problems and like how do people interact with the world, which is why I got the job at Google.
Right. So you mentioned your favorite class in college.
Yeah.
Was at Wellesley, a seminar class. Can you talk about that class?
Yeah. The Biogeography.
Yes,
one? Yeah.
yes.
So what I these are my favorites, but they've definitely been the most useful. Olin and Wellesley are 5 minutes apart by car, and they're very close collaborators. And if I ever get an SEC award, I'm going to give like a large fraction of it to Wellesley. Awesome. Because I think they're just amazing. And I took this class on biogeography, which is the distribution of living things around the world. And for context, biogeography deals a lot with something called speciation, which is you had this animal here on the mainland. There's this scattering across this series of islands where it gets slightly different over time. Like, how does that happen? Like, how do you go from species A to species B? And what's interesting about that is you have to understand kind of like what are the forces that are pulling these populations apart. And why this was so important to my career later on was we think of AI as very clean. You know, like before I gave the analogy of like, is version A of your algorithm better or is version B better? The reality is when we talk about industrial artificial intelligence, which these systems are a form of, there's not one stakeholder. There's not one way of assessing is this good or bad. There's 20 or 30 stakeholders, right? Yeah. Is it good for kids? Is it good for people who don't speak English? Is it good for older people? Is it good for new users, power users? There's a lot of different ways to cut that problem. And biogeography taught me how to think about populations instead of being like, here is a population, is it good or is it bad? To be like, no, every population is heterogeneous. It has lots of different things. And when you put a differential force on that, when you put something that's going to be exerting, pressure, some of those groups are going to move more than others. And that way of thinking is not obvious, but it ended up being super impactful in my time at Pinterest, which is the first time I really started dealing with, we have to think about success in these numerical ways. It was extremely useful at my time at Facebook.
So you graduate as a history-loving engineer, and you find yourself going to the West Coast to work for Google. How did that happen?
They're the only ones who gave me a job.
Wow.
It was really simple. I didn't really have like a plan B after I graduated from college. Like I thought I would go try to do a startup. A lot of my friends, I think, were smarter, and they went straight to get PhDs. Yeah. They're like, we're not accredited. I'm going to wait this out for a couple of years.
Oh, when you graduated, your school wasn't yet accredited.
So,
okay.
We were, to give you context, there's another small engineering college called Harvey Mudd, which is on the West Coast. When they went through their accreditation process, they actually accepted, it's either 2 or 4 transfer students as juniors when their main kids were freshmen.
Okay.
Because that allowed them to educate a few students so they could get accreditation.
Oh, interesting. Yes.
In the case of Olin, we all came in as one batch. Right. And so when we hit that wall, which is graduation, there was a 6-month lag before we got accredited. Right. So I graduated with an unaccredited engineering degree. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that baby engineers, like when you first crack out of the egg of an undergraduate education, you're not super useful, right? You're very raw, you're informed, you can be very bright and will have potential, but like you really need to be embedded in a community, like a company, that can help you actually then, get to the boots on the ground phase.
Right. And
the companies that generally do that kind of formation are, as a general rule, or in terms of the largest share of that work, are big companies. And those big companies, because they know they're channeling a bunch of young engineers through a filtering process, they often have long timelines. It's like you apply in the fall to start a full year later. They have strict criteria because they want to be fair. An unaccredited engineering degree is going to immediately knock you out of that pipeline. And I hadn't really thought about all those constraints when I was either in school or applying to Olin.
Yeah.
And so what was interesting was Google didn't really care, right? Like Google had, they had enough money that they could be like, whatever, we'll do a bespoke process for everyone. Some of their best engineers were high school dropouts.
Right.
Why would they care if my engineering degree was accredited? And I got the initial interview because one of my professors had worked with an early engineer at Google.
Okay.
And then when I got on the ground for my in-person interviews, I was like, I have to get this job.
Yes.
Like, I have to get this job. There have been no other tentacles out for interesting jobs that have made any real movement. And so I made a portfolio of product ideas. Like I sat there and I'd run the yearbook in college, these skills that we don't realize are going to be useful in the future. So I laid out 10 really lovely designed product ideas for Google and explained why this would be good for the business model. And I made a bunch of copies so each interviewer could have their own, glossy folder kind of thing. And in the 8 years I was at Google, so I was at Google for most of my career, before I got sick, and it's really fascinating. So I interviewed probably 150 people for that job. So associate product manager or product manager one, so junior product managers. In that entire time, how many people even brought their resume to the interview?
Really?
How many? Give me a guess.
I would guess half at least.
5.
Wow.
Maybe 5. Right?
Wow.
No one brought anything because probably the recruiter was like, you don't need to bring anything.
Right.
We have a PDF.
Yes.
So imagine I show up and I'm like, here.
Yes.
I really want this job.
Yes.
And I ended up being the first woman hired into that program in 14 months.
Wow.
So 30 men got hired,
Yeah.
and then me. And I'm an anomaly because I have an analog, not a digital, an analog electrical engineering degree. And 80% of everyone else has a CS degree.
Right. So you talk about, and we'll talk about Harvard Business School here in a second, but you talk about a blue ocean strategy, which, by the way, is my favorite book.
Yeah.
One of my favorite books. This idea of don't do what everyone else does.
Yeah.
Find your spot, plant your flag, and go out in that direction. How much does that color what you do? It seems like you do that in every stop.
I would say, I think because I have always, I've never, so I very deeply have, actually, let me back up one. So there's a lot of things about how I grew up or who I am that I didn't really understand until I studied abroad in Sweden. So I studied abroad in Sweden in college, and in just like we in the United States have American history or American sociology classes you can take in college, they have Nordic studies. Right? They're like, hey, this place in the world has existed for 10,000 years. We have a culture. There's things. And there were all this kind of programming that I had grown up with in the Midwest, with my parents, because I come from a family that is Norwegian on my dad's side, that I had never had articulated. And very strongly, I have certain things like, you are no better than anyone else. You don't want to stand out. You want to blend into the crowd.
Yeah.
And I had never had those messages articulated to me until I studied abroad in Sweden. Wow. And my peers would explain Nordic culture to me. I'd be like, oh, we have this problem in the Midwest, right?
Yes.
Because for example, I'd go to class and my professor would be like, I really like that you're in class, Francis, because you raise your hand. And I went, what do you mean? He goes, if you'll notice, no one else raises their hand until you raise your hand.
Yeah.
Because it's considered arrogant that you would presume that you had an answer that other people didn't know.
Interesting.
Right. So imagine you have that's the programming that runs in the back of your head. I feel very earnestly about this. It means that you have the freedom to also just go do things that make you happy. Right? If you don't think there's something special about you, it's why wouldn't you go just do the thing that makes you happy?
Amen.
And that's just what I've always done is, I in high school I found myself in all these pockets where I was the only girl. I would do robotics or something, or I did math very, very well, so math competitions. And, it makes you have to become comfortable with the idea that you're just different.
Right.
Right? Doesn't mean you're special. Like I said, the Nordic programming is right in the back. But it's you might as well just go do what you want to do because, something's different about you. And just go wander into the field.
Love it.
Yeah.
So speaking of trying to do something different,
Sure.
Harvard Business School.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused about the timeline there.
Sure.
Did you apply before you went to
I did.
Google?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I
Can you
applied
talk
in
to
college.
why
Yeah.
you decided to go apply to Harvard Business School?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
why Google? How did all that work out?
So when I was in college, so HBS saw a trend in their data, which was the average number of years of work experience people had was going up and up each year.
Yeah.
Because people were looking at the admissions criteria. They're saying like the average class, and it would say like, the average student at HBS has 3 years of college. Oh, I need 3 years of college, or not college, work experience.
Yes.
Now it's 3.5. Now it's 4. Now it's 4.5.
True.
And when I was in college, it had gone up to 4.5. And it was creeping into a window where if it got any, lose basically a large fraction of all the women in the program. Because it was going to start to conflict with like when people would generally start having kids. And so they were like, if we want to have a diverse class, and we want to like not have this go until people have 15 years of work experience, right? Because that's what's going to happen.
For sure.
We need to start intentionally figuring out how we bring in people earlier. And so what they did, and they were kind of feeling like they were losing really high quality candidates to law school. Because law school could tell you, you're really bright, you could do anything. You can go to law school right now. And it used to be you could go to business school straight out of college.
Right.
Like that was a common thing. And so they said, we're going to start this program where we want you to apply your senior year. And we'll tell you your senior year whether or not you have a guaranteed seat.
Interesting.
Only back then, they hadn't formalized it into a program now. So now it's called 2+2. So it's like, go do 2 years of work experience, 2 years of HBS. We'll do a bunch of fun enrichment in those 2 years before you go, network you, it'll be fun. I was before that. I was like part of the experimental cohort. And so they kind of told us in this open house, you just go straight from college. And then I get this deferral letter. So I don't get straight in. I get told, go get a job. And I was like, well,
any job.
Any job.
Fill the time.
Yeah, go work. And I was like, and so when I wrote to the HBS, because I think they assumed if you're good enough to have made it through our hoops, of course you have a job lined up. Right? There's no way you wouldn't have a job lined up.
Right.
And because I was this little anomaly in terms of like I have an unaccredited engineering degree,
Right.
I like kind of broke their little mold.
So that's why getting that job at Google was so
So
important.
critical. Yeah.
Got it.
Well, it was also like the process of trying to get a job made me realize it was going to be hard to get a job.
Got it.
Right? Because I applied to something like 55 jobs, and I got maybe 4 phone screens and 3 in-person interviews. No, 2 in-person interviews.
And do you think
Yeah.
that's because of the unaccredited college?
I think I couldn't get over the first hump.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So at Google, I know you worked on a bunch of different things, but
And
Google.
I didn't know how to apply for jobs. Rather, so today, if I had sat down with my previous self, I would have been like, okay, we're going to go on LinkedIn. We're going to find people who work at that company. We're going to send a whole bunch of emails and be like, I'm really interested in your company. Can we do a phone call? If some of those phone calls went well, I'd be like, could you recommend me? I would have known this is the dance you do.
Yes.
And I didn't know how to. My parents are academics.
Right.
You get a PhD, and then you do a fellowship, and then
This is a master class for people graduating from college who don't quite understand how to get that next step.
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Doing something different, thinking through the job that you're applying for, the company, what their needs are, showing up to the interview with pre-thought through great ideas. Yeah. Hope everyone's listening to that. So Google Books became one of your focuses. So you grew up in a house with 5,000 books.
Yeah.
Makes sense that you would gravitate in that area.
Yeah.
So what were you working on with Google Books?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
It's also like I spent a huge amount of my high school years in large academic libraries, right? So the University of Iowa is an incredibly generous institution in that you can walk in as a community member and say, I'd like a library card, and get one.
Wow.
And the nearest kind of public space to where I lived was either the hospital or the law library, right? Like that. And so sitting in a hospital corridor is not like a great place to do your homework.
No.
Sitting in a totally empty law library, great place to do your homework. So I had like this emotional attachment to libraries. And my great-grandfather's portrait hangs in the Iowa Law Library.
Oh, very cool.
So like there was a table where I could sit and do my homework, and like he was there, right? And so I finished my first year at Google. So they assign you to a job first year on this program, rotational management program. And I worked on ads, which was a really educational experience. And then you do your first rotation. And Marissa Meyer, who was then my boss's boss, or no, I guess I was in the ads chain, but she ran the program.
Okay.
The
Later
program.
CEO of Yahoo.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. She suggested I go talk to Google Books. Like, it hadn't even really been on my radar. And as soon as she suggested it, I was like, oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because I have this like little secret dream, which is not that secret because it's in the book, which is because I was a Cold War Studies minor, I knew that in the early 90s, this is like right after the wall falls, some academics went into Russia and started scanning the Soviet archives because it was like this moment of like openness. And this moment of openness lasted for like 4 years, 5 years, and then Russia started to get embarrassed by some of the stuff that was getting published, and they closed things back down. And so the only record of this period of time, like this incredibly important, like why did the world shift in these ways, is now found in microfiche in the United States, or like digitized microfiche in the United States. And I have this dream that one day, all of these things are cyclical. Like, part of why I can work on things like social media reform is I don't think on months or years, I think on decades. And like one day Russia will open up again. Like, it might take 50 years, but there'll be another moment. And I told my manager when I did my first interview for Google Books, I was like, one day we can go scan the rest of the archive, right? Like, that's why I want to work on Google Books.
Right.
And I think he didn't expect to hear that, and so I got the job. But the thing I worked on Google Books, I worked on a bunch of different things. So I launched their first API, which is the ability to have outside applications from Google be able to use Google data. I launched the first mobile book reader. So like there's a quote in the New York Times, like we beat the Kindle to the iPhone, right? A bunch of things like that. But the main thing I worked on was something called search quality. So we take for granted that, we talked about algorithms before about, what's the first post, the second post, the third post. When it comes to search results, it's very similar. So we look across all the possible things we could show you, and we say, this is going to be the first, this is going to be the second, this is going to be the third thing we're going to show you. And that process was only just starting, like that field was very young, right? So even at Google, so this is 2007, they had only really gotten good at formalizing it in less than the last 10 years.
Okay.
Right, because Google's formed in 96, Amit Singhal came in from Amazon and like basically helped them rewrite search maybe in 2000, 2001.
Wow.
Where like even Google, which we think of like, oh, Google knows how to do everything.
Right.
Even Google struggled to be like, how do you consistently over time make search results better? Like, it's not obvious.
Yeah.
So that art, there are very few places in the world that you could learn it. And my engineering director could not get a product manager from the proper search quality team to work on books.
Okay.
Because the search team was like, books only have old data. Like, why would we care? Old information. And so he's like, Francis, you are smart. I'm going to teach you how to do this. And the other part that I am so grateful for was this was early enough in the time of like, we should use data to make decisions. Right? It sounds like bonkers to us in 2023.
Sure.
But this is 2007. The first people in the world with the title data scientist are getting that title that year, right?
Yeah.
Or a different time. He's invested in building out the first kind of database for behavior on Google Books. And he's like, I can't get anyone to use it, but I can order you to use it. Tell me interesting things. Yeah. Or like my actual boss, like the product manager or director, he'd be like, I have to speak at a conference. Tell me something interesting from our logs, like the records of how people interact with things. And so I'm getting this interesting on-the-ground experience in learning data science because these two people are like, no one will tell us anything. Like, you have to go find it. And so I got this education that I wouldn't have gotten if I'd worked on just about anything else.
Not taught in schools.
Yeah,
not in a book.
Yeah,
it's on the ground.
No,
Yeah. So at some point.
And actually, to draw the circle back, that's one of the fundamental problems that we as like a society have to talk about.
Yes.
Which is we have these opaque systems, so these very complicated technical systems that are directing the information in our societies. And the way you get to learn about them is you have to get a job at the company.
Inside the walls.
Inside the walls.
Yes.
And now you have to be bought in. There's stakes for like sharing that information, and that is a societal problem that we have to talk about.
So we'll certainly come back to your story. That concern is, I think, really goes to the crux. I think what a lot of people, certainly what I do, have a concern about. Especially with publicly traded companies.
Oh,
the fact that we have closed, opaque companies have a black box that we can't tell you what's happening inside of. But just trust us and invest with us is a real problem, right?
Huge problem. So I'm founding a nonprofit called Be On the Screen, and one of the stakeholder groups we want to work with is investors. And usually when you form a nonprofit, you're like, we're going to help the puppies, we're going to help the children, we're going to help wonderful elders in our community. Not very many people are like, we got to help the investors, right? But the reality is, right now, we have large, powerful institutions that allocate huge amounts of capital, money, to influence where the world is going to go. And those large, these people who should be making important allocation decisions in terms of we as a society are going to invest our hard-earned gains in this way or that way, they're saying to us things like, we got blindsided by Facebook. We were told this is always going to go up. We were never told any of the risks. We didn't even know what questions to ask. If we had been dealing with a car company, we could have said, hey, we've noticed a larger number of complaints are coming in. Or we could say, hey, we've noticed there are more lawsuits. What's going on? What's your plan to deal with that? We could have played our accountability role. And because we have been denied the chance to even learn what questions to ask, we can't play that accountability role in society.
That element of transparency and accountability are so important, not just from an institutional investor standpoint, but for mom and pop shops that are trying to invest their hard-earned money.
Their retirement accounts.
Very important.
College savings.
I love that you have the business background too. If we can talk about Harvard Business School for a second. So when you came there, you had some work experience. You're at Google. You had your studying Cold War. How did Harvard Business School change your thinking about the way the world operates?
So I came into Harvard really caring about organizational health. So have you seen the TV show Silicon Valley?
Yes.
So I have only seen maybe 2 or 3 episodes of the show because for your listeners or your viewers, it's supposed to be a comedy, right? The TV comedy. I think of it as a documentary because most of they did a really, really good job of talking to actual people in Silicon Valley to get the jokes and the circumstances and all those things. And things they play for laughs, I've seen happen to real people, and it's not funny when it happens. It's not funny when it happens to a real person.
Right.
And none of it happened to me, but I watched things like I had a coworker who was underperforming, and instead of just firing them, they moved everyone else off the team but left him, and then left him in a room by himself. So every other engineer sits in a room with 4 or 6 people, and he's down this little twisting hallway, and the only person who talks to him is me because I'm still his product manager. I would like him to work, but think about it, that's the Rest Invest story from Silicon Valley.
100%.
And so, I go into HBS being I really care about how organizations can be healthy, how, we spend a third of our lives on work. How can we make certain places where people thrive, where people can be most fully impactful in the world? We can get along with each other. And so I came up with that goal, but then I got this much, much, much broader education. So they make us take political economy classes and ethics classes, and I took a class on green business that was super fascinating because a lot of those consequences, it's 13 years down the road, they're playing out now, right? I think the most important thing I learned at HBS, though, was that the world changes incredibly slowly, right? So in Silicon Valley, all of the funding cycles are in 2-year time horizons. It's you tell us how you're going to change the world in 2 years. And now it's shifting a little bit because companies generally IPO in 7 to 10 years. So people say, I want to know a longer arc. But in 2006, 2007, like we were still in the wake of the 90s, where like, you know, Netscape IPO'd 18 months after it was founded for billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Right? And so you listen to people talk, and it's very much like, if I don't do X by the time I'm 30, I've failed.
Yes.
And so I go to HBS and I learn basically every name brand company you've heard of, or like or like things that were interesting that companies have done. They take like 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the secondary thing I learned there was, you know, they made I took a class inadvertently. Like I took a class because I wanted a specific class schedule. Like I only wanted to go to school like 2.5 days a week. I wanted to go be able to code at Google. I wanted to go travel my other time. This class was about the idea that every executive, like we can look at their lives and say, oh, they got on an escalator of success and it was just like straight up to the top.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that when you sit down with CEOs and ask them about their lives, every single one of them has a story about a crucible they faced, like a moment where, you know, they got sick, someone close to them got sick, they really messed up at work, they maybe got a drug habit, like all kinds of things can happen to someone. And the difference between a CEO and someone who ends up in the gutter is they've corrected. You know,
Right.
They said, I can stumble and I can get back up.
Persevere. Mm-hmm.
And I think probably the most important thing for me on that long time horizon, like one was, you have to think about your life as a journey.
Mm-hmm.
You have to think about it as chapters. You're going to live to be quite old. What are you going to do at that time? But the second thing was, when I got so sick in my late 20s, instead of saying, oh, I failed, you know, like I was such a you know, top performer my entire life. That's why I got each of these opportunities.
Yeah.
You know, now I will never get back on that course. I was able to say, actually, no, I'm going through my crucible.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, yes, I can't walk. Yes, I'm so weak I can't feed myself.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm like incontinent. Like that's how falling apart I am.
Yeah.
But I can get back up, and I did. And one of the things that I wanted to go into more in this book, but I didn't get a chance because the book is already kind of long, right? Like the book I wrote is the one that I think we as a society need right now. But the book I may one day write, if I ever get over the PTSD of writing the first one, is, you know, we tell ourselves stories about why we are not powerful. And the thing I learned from basically losing everything, right? So in that moment in my life, like my husband left me. I lost my job because my manager at Google thought I was lying about being so sick. I was on death's door, right? Like the things that happened to me in the hospital have a 10% fatality rate, right? Like it's not trivial. I'm alone. I lost almost all my savings renovating a house and having my like co-owner embezzle. I mean, just thing after thing. You know, I came back from people's worst fears and rebuilt a life that I really loved before, like I joined Facebook. And that knowledge that we can lose things and rebuild allowed me, when I faced a situation where I had to choose to follow my heart or not, it gave me the power to pursue like what I thought was right.
Do you know who David Goggins is?
No.
So
Yeah.
David Goggins,
Yeah.
he wrote a best-selling book called Can't Hurt Me. He was a 20-year Navy SEAL who went through a horrific childhood.
Yeah.
Became 300 pounds, lost the weight, became a Navy SEAL. Remarkable story. And he talks about all the horrible things he went through this childhood with abuse from his father and all this stuff. And he goes, that's my cookie jar. When I go through a rough time, I think, well, this isn't as bad as this, right? To me, it sounds like, you know, you had your own, like, I'm still alive. I'm still pushing forward. And that's just a common thread. We talked earlier about some of our friends who are whistleblowers. They all have that story, the crucible moment.
Yeah.
So there's a great quote in your book about how long change takes. You said, meaningful change, real change, happens slowly. The thing that most of us, most often, because of real change, is the fear that we're not being successful enough, fast enough.
Yeah.
It's a great quote. So you graduate Harvard Business School, and then now you're back at Google. What were you doing at Google at this point?
So I came back into Google, and I got to work on Google Plus.
Yes.
So Google Plus is I think a fascinating tale of like what happens when you try to start a social network with too many resources, right? So Google looked at what was happening on Facebook and said, we're facing kind of an existential threat, which is Google thrives off of an open internet. They want people to be interacting freely.
Yeah.
They want to have a diverse ecosystem because their businesses, they go pull that information from those different places and they make it easy to access. Facebook, on the other hand, they get their power, their money by owning data, by owning attention, by owning that ecosystem, and there's no incentive for them to share. Right? And so Google looked at that and said, oh, like we need to make sure we are also facilitating this kind of, user-produced content ecosystem in a way that we can access it because there is a larger and larger part of the internet that is now closed off. And so they decided to start Google+, and it was really fascinating for me because it's like my first experience getting to see kind of social software. So, by the time I joined Facebook, I'd worked on Google+, Yelp, and Pinterest. And so it's kind of like my first chapter into that space.
Right. So the plus part of Google was that this
social
part.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Google, prior to Google+, some applications at Google had the ability to share. You say like, hey, you can read my Google Doc, my spreadsheet. They all used like different visual language. They often used different systems for saying like, who are you? So you might have multiple accounts. This is one of these beautiful things about the internet. Like the internet did not grow in a coherent, beautiful package. It grew in like fits and starts in different spots. And the reality was across Google, you might actually have 5 or 6 different Google accounts prior to 2011.
Yeah.
Right? And so part of Google Plus was just saying, hey, we have never actually acknowledged that people exist. Right? Like I always like to joke that the design methodology of Google for a long time was, after looking at all the data, we have a strong suspicion that human beings exist. Right? But so like the Google said, hey, like, part of why Facebook has been so successful is they've done actually a really good job of hiring designers and product managers, even engineers, that are social. They are people on the internet. We need to actually take a hard look at how we as a company interact with our users and say, hey, identity matters. Like the idea that you are a person and the same person is using all these things. Relationships and interactions between people matter. Like we need to have the same ways of describing those relationships so that, if you share a bunch of stuff with someone on this application, when you start typing their name on this one, we should know that. Like you shouldn't get a random person.
Right.
You should get the person you actually wanted. And so as much as people like to say Google Plus failed, that kind of fixing of Google or like setting the groundwork for Google saying, hey, you actually need to be a company that is human-centric.
Yes.
I think has been incredibly successful. And even things like saying people have characteristics, like I identify as a woman, right? Like even things like that, Google didn't have that data. And one of the things that I think is often like not thought about enough is Google made enough more ad revenue just being able to let people say, hey, this is who I am. That even though Google blew $500 million in Google Plus, they've easily made it up over time.
Okay. So you got sick.
I did.
You talked a little bit about that. You took 15 months off.
I did.
Is
I
that
had to.
right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what happened there, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So I went through a phase that started maybe 6 months after I joined Google Plus.
Yeah.
So I've been in grad school for 22 months. I've been out of the Bay Area. I come back. I'm healthy for maybe 6 months, and then I start to get really tired. I started to be in a lot of pain. And I went to the doctor a number of times, and they were like, oh, you're in a lot of pain, you're tired, it sounds like you have depression. And I did not have depression. I had a very rare, slow-growing clot in my leg that by the time I ended up with a blue leg in the hospital, it was a foot long, and it was the size of a cigar, like the size of a hot dog.
This is the point where you were talking to your parents, and you said, I think I'm going to go get a massage, and then go to the doctor? Is that...
Well, because I wake up one morning, and my leg is like, they're not the same color. And like my eventual ex-husband and I are still like friends. Like we still hang out at each other's places. And he was like, "Your legs aren't the same color." And I like looked down. I was like, "They are not the same color."
But they didn't hurt. It just was blue.
Yeah, it was just like slightly blue, right? And one of the things I learned once I got to the hospital was that if you have a partially blocked vein or artery.
Yeah.
So the blood's slowing down. Your body's very smart. It starts to grow these things called peripherals around it. And because the flow in my leg had so slowly stopped, more and more peripherals had grown around it. And so so the day that my leg turned blue, it was just enough of the flow had cut off that now it was just done.
Right.
Or all those like coping mechanisms were done. And that's why I was probably in so much pain for so long, was I didn't have adequate flow to my leg. Like there were all these issues that were going on.
Wow.
My heart was probably working extra hard because it's having to still move the blood around my body, but now it has to do this weird thing on my leg. So I get this like slightly blue leg. I'm really tired at this point. I've gotten to the point where I had been using a wheelchair regularly if I needed to leave the house. Wow. So like if I was going to drive somewhere, I'd walk to my car, get in the car. But like if I had to go to the grocery store, I'd probably bring my wheelchair. Or like if I needed to like be out and about for a while, I'd bring my wheelchair.
Yeah.
Because no one had given me the advice that actually a walker is the way to go. You don't want to go straight to a wheelchair because you want to try to move as much as possible. So I called my parents and I'm like, what do I have to do about this? And I had a massage that I was really looking forward to later that day. And in the way of an invincible 29-year-old, I was like, can I go to my massage and then go to the ER? Because, I have,
it's hard to get an appointment. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's hard to get an appointment and, it feel really good and like, this sucks. But it's also, I was raised by a doctor. And my mother likes to say that doctors often have therapeutic nihilism. This idea of like, oh, whatever, they're not going to do anything for me.
Yeah.
But my parents were like, no, you need to go to the ER right now. And so I went into the ER, and it turned out that I had this huge clot. And part of what was kind of formational about that time period was it wasn't simple. Like I came in and they said, you'll go home in 3 days. And they kept saying that for a month.
Yikes. Yeah.
And it turned out that because it was so large and where it was, because it'd been in there for so long, the first couple of things they tried to get it out didn't work. They ended up having to do surgery 3 times. The day I was supposed to go home, like 11 days in, I had been so bored at this point that I was like doing science on myself basically. Like I had gotten them to give me a Sharpie so I could like very precisely measure the same place on my leg each time and say like this is how much small. So I'll give you an example. Things were so out of whack that my left leg was 10 centimeters bigger than my right leg.
Wow.
Just because it was so swollen.
Yeah.
So I could tell them things like my leg is coming down, that kind of thing. Because I'm really bored. I've been stuck in the bed for 11 days. And the day they were supposed to like let me out, they came by for rounds, and I was like, I have this weird rash on my leg. It's like new since yesterday. And they looked down and they got really quiet and they left.
Never a good sign.
And maybe it was 14 days in. Yeah, it was like 14 days in, because that day the next day. So the next day, my parents arrive. So my parent, like I said, it's a DVT. It's not supposed to be a big deal.
Yeah.
Like when I first called them in the hospital, they didn't know it was as big as it was. And my parents were like, this is no big deal. Your mom's had one. You'll be out in 3 days. We'll come visit you in 2 weeks, right? Because like plane tickets are cheaper if you buy them a little further out.
Right.
Thrifty Norwegians. And so my parents finally show up, and they've been monitoring where I am from afar. Like my dad is calling every day because he runs a clinical lab at a hospital. And so he's a great person to have in your back pocket if you're in the hospital, because he knows all the tests that all the doctors he sees orders. So my dad knows exactly how bad the situation is. They've discovered at this point that I am so malnourished from the celiacs that my protein synthesis had stopped.
Wow.
Right? Like this is one of those things that has unfolded.
Right.
So my parents get there, and at this point, the nurses have begun to take pity on me. So I went into the hospital with like one of the most important pieces of life advice I can give people is when you are in the hospital, be nice to everyone. Because my father used to come home from these things called morbidity and mortality reviews, which is like when an error happens in the hospital, why did it happen? Like, why did this person die? And he would occasionally be like, if you're ever in the hospital, be nice to everyone you meet, because the people who die of totally unavoidable things are usually very unpleasant people. or their families are.
Yeah.
Right? And so people just don't check in on them as often. So I'm being like really nice to everyone, trying really hard, even though I'm like not very well. And so they have taken pity on me and now have given me a single, which is the isolation room. So like this isn't as an airlock. You know, if I had some mysterious disease, they would put you in this room, right? So it's very small, and my parents have come to visit me, and suddenly half an hour after they come in, all of my doctors appear. Like all of the interns appear, all the residents appear, my attending appears, and they're like, you have heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, which is acronym to HIT. You've got HIT.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that means you're having an allergic reaction to the drug heparin, and it is killing all of your platelets.
Oh, okay, I didn't get this. Okay.
And the reason we had to take it out of the book.
Okay.
Like all the health, like how do we get up when we fall down? It had to be taken out because the book's long enough as it is.
So my wife is a physician, and she's asking me, it's like, why was she? Okay,
Yeah.
now it makes
So-
sense. It wasn't
so-
in the book. Okay,
no,
okay,
yeah,
right.
So I'm. They're like, so to finish the sentence.
Yeah.
Heparin-induced thrombocytopenia is where you have an allergic reaction to heparin, which is a blood thinner. Like if you got in a car accident, they would give you heparin, and it's a miracle drug. It would save your life. It would keep you from getting like a stroke or like an embolism in your lungs. For 1 to 2% of the population, it kills all their platelets.
Wow.
So you start to bleed to death. So the reason I had that rash on my leg was I was bleeding out of my capillaries.
Whoa. Wow.
Is that not crazy? And the thing that's super crazy to me is they almost sent me home, right? Like if I hadn't been like bored in my hospital bed and been like, I've got this weird rash, I would have gone home alone, and I would have, if I'd fallen, I could have bled to death.
You would have bled out.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
Because I lived alone, right? Yeah. And so suddenly, like my parents were very kind, and they went home and did a lot of research, and then they didn't tell me any of it. Right? They're like, she can find out after if she wants to ask. But it meant that that stay got extended and extended and extended because they couldn't stabilize my clotting. Like they couldn't get me into a place where I was safe to go home. And so I ended up going home after about 4 weeks, and I was very stubborn, and I didn't go to a nursing home, and I should have, because I was actually too weak to take care of myself. And I ended up back in the hospital maybe 6 weeks later because I fell. And if you look very carefully, I have a little scar.
Yeah.
And it's because I hit my head, and I have no memory of it.
Wow.
And so I ended up in the hospital with aphasia.
Yeah.
So I couldn't even explain to the doctors, like, why was I there? And that time I went to rehab.
So this is the cookie jar.
This is my cookie jar.
Your cookie jar is pretty full.
Yeah.
At this point, were you still employed with Google?
No,
or
because
you had been fired
I'd gone put on a performance improvement plan.
Yeah.
But I had accepted basically like a severance.
Yep.
And I had left, right? Because I was dealing with like, I can either leave and know I have a little bit of cash.
Yes.
Or I can wait for them to fire me.
Yep.
And I didn't, actually, part of what was complicated about that time period was I didn't know that I still qualified for disability.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you get sick within like a year or something when you leave, you actually still qualify.
Right.
And when I was in the hospital, right after I got out of the hospital, one of the nurse practitioners was like, we are going to help you file for disability.
Yeah.
And that definitely made it possible for me to be able to spend 15 months rehabbing.
Wow. What a story.
Yeah.
So you have this experience, you almost died.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You decide to go back to work at some point.
Yeah, I felt like I had to go back to work when I did because I was out of savings.
You didn't want to tap your retirement funds.
Yes, I should have done that.
And that's an advice you give in the book.
I do. In the book I say, like, we hear over and over and over again, do not touch your retirement funds.
Yeah.
And we don't give the right level of gray in that it's not actually a black and white issue. It's things may happen to you in your life where you can either make really forced short-sighted decisions and not tap that money, or you can say, hey, I'm giving myself $20,000, $10,000. Like, I know I'm supposed to put this in my retirement account, but I'm buying time so that I can make higher quality decisions.
Right.
Because for a very small fraction of my retirement funds, I could have given myself 3 more months.
Which you really could have used.
Which I would have, it would have changed how I thought about which jobs to take. Because I took the second job I got offered, right? Because I was like, oh, like I'd had this experience at Google where, you know, my self-esteem was really low.
And this was the job at Yelp.
The job at Yelp. Yeah.
Okay. So how was Yelp different than Google at this point? Yeah.
So I think that is not obvious to people who are outside of Silicon Valley is that there are different tech companies have different amounts of profitability. Right? Sounds really obvious when I say it out loud. It's very easy when you're not in Silicon Valley to say, like, oh, these are all brand name companies. They must be all like equally successful.
Right.
And Yelp had a really hard challenge, which is its business model is not super profitable, right? So most of
Still today.
even I think still today. I haven't checked the numbers recently.
Okay.
But in 2016 when I was there, which was 7 years ago, it was definitely not GAAP profitable. So like if you use standard accounting principles, once you account for all the stock options they would give people or stock they would give people, it wasn't profitable.
Right.
But the so I come in. So one of the consequences of that fact. So some are more profitable, some are less profitable. Is that in general you get higher quality talent at places that are more profitable. And I came into Yelp and I was very surprised because like they had remarkably good people. They just had very young people.
Yes.
Right. So they had figured out a way to keep the lights on by getting really high quality people from like B tier technical programs. And then, keeping them by saying, hey, if you stay for this period of time, we'll make you a people manager. And very few places in Silicon Valley will make a 25-year-old a people manager or like a brand name place. And so that was my first experience working with things like artificial intelligence because I got to launch the first computer vision feature at Yelp.
So what does that mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
So we take for granted today that when we open, say, Google Photos, they'll have characterized our photos into different things. So, for example, there's like a memories feature where they'll pop up a thing, say, this dinner you went to. Like, I never said that these photos taken over 2 hours were a dinner. The geolocation, though, is at a restaurant. There's pictures of food. There's pictures of wine. Like, if you were able to have a computer and say, what is this about? The computer would say, oh, you had a dinner. So that process was relatively young in 2016. Like the research had been around for a lot longer, but in terms of having features where you say, hey, let's look at just the menu photos from this restaurant. 2% of all the photos from the restaurant are menu photos, but people really want them. Can we help people find the menu photos? That process of sorting through all the photos and finding the menus is called computer vision.
Okay, great. So Yelp, which I used last night, by the way.
I use it all the time.
Yeah, very helpful. But at this time, it was really focused on restaurants, right? Everything else was not much.
Most people think of it as for restaurants. They make most of their money off of you searched for a plumber. Yeah, and so that's the challenge, is that for most people in most places, they are not, there are not enough, say, Thai restaurants for any individual Thai restaurant to be like, I want to do an ad. Right? And so the places where there's actually competition are like, you want a lawyer, you want a plumber, you need your carpets cleaned. And so they make almost all their revenue from those service things. But most of the searches are for food.
So the plumber is paying to be listed on Yelp. Okay, got it.
First on Yelp,
What did you like about working there?
What did I like about working there? So I had just come out of this like traumatic experience where like I thought I had not been eating gluten and I had been exposed to gluten. And I was in the process of like working with a doctor to like actually eat correctly, right? Like to figure out like what would make me healthy. And it meant that and this is still true today, like every time I leave my home, I have to have a plan on how I'm going to eat. And my top tool, like the thing that was going to keep me from ever having that experience again, was Yelp.
Got it.
It's like that's what Yelp was to me.
Why did you leave Yelp?
Why did I leave Yelp? So I had a very close friend who is like a big brother figure to me. Like his kids are my godsons. He reached out and said, hey, like you have a very specific skill set. Like you worked on search quality for years. You can do algorithms. We need a product manager for the home feed at Pinterest. And Pinterest was like this very sparkling, relatively new tech company. And compared to Yelp, which, Yelp is always a little struggling, and the fact that it was just a newer tech stack, like there was an opportunity to make something out of Pinterest, I ended up taking that offer.
So then you were at Pinterest. But you were there for a relatively short period of time, if I remember
I think
right.
2 years.
2 years,
Yeah.
okay.
Which is long in Silicon Valley.
It's long in Silicon,
Yeah.
it's all relative, okay.
Yeah. 2 years, like the general rule is like if you stay longer than 2 to 3 years, you end up making less over the course of your career because every time you change, you get a salary bump.
Got it. So zigzagging across Silicon Valley, you work your way up. Okay, awesome. So Facebook.
But the thing that I learned at Pinterest was, so I worked on search quality primarily at Yelp, right? So I did do some computer vision. I did do some stuff around can we productize our data?
Right.
So that's things like you go to a restaurant, we tell you like what do people usually search for about this restaurant?
Yeah.
Like, what are the facets that are interesting about a Thai restaurant versus a Greek restaurant versus your dry cleaners?
Yeah.
What do other people usually care about? But I primarily worked on search quality, which is similar to what I did at Google. Pinterest was the first time I worked on what's known as a recommender system.
Okay.
So a recommender system is, and this is important for people to understand because recommender systems now drive a huge amount of the information we consume. So the search system, right, remember we talked at the beginning, we all see the same thing. It's also driven by what you ask for. Like if you show up to Google without asking for something, you see a white screen with a box. With a recommender system, we say, hey, we've watched what you've engaged with in the past. We've seen what your interests. In the case of Pinterest, we know what boards you made, what your friends have done. We're going to show you a bunch of other stuff you might like. Or like on Facebook, like you don't show up to Facebook and say, tell me what Alice is doing. Tell me what Bob's doing. Tell me what Carol's doing. They show you stuff. And that's a very different kind of technical system because you have to manage it in a very different way. And that was the first time I worked with those kinds of systems.
So my first experience with this was with Amazon saying, we recommend
might
the
like
following
this.
books.
Yeah.
Right.
That was the first commercial recommender system.
Okay.
So for context, this is like one of the things I talk about in the book.
Yeah.
The laws that govern the internet today were written in 1996 with something called we call it Section 230, usually casually. In 1996, there were no commercially available recommender systems. And that feature you're talking about, it came out in 1999.
Amazing. Right.
And the first feed happened in 2008 with Facebook. The first algorithmic feed happened in 2011.
Yes.
So like 15 years went by before the first algorithmic feed happened.
So this is putting on my lawyer hat. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. I was a freshman in college. That's the first time I learned about the electronic mail. You say, come over and get your electronic mail. So that law that came in online
which was
then,
about bulletin boards.
Correct. Is now supposedly driving the boat for modern day. So a lot of people, look askance at Facebook pointing to Section 230 for protection and saying, come on, guys, like, this had nothing to do with what you guys are doing today. Salesforce recently had a case, I believe, worked its way to the Supreme Court, pointing to Section 230, and the court said, no, this doesn't give you protection there. You actually have to have some liability when people misuse your platform. You can't just say, I'm just providing a platform for participation. You actually have to monitor what's happening there. So as a lawyer on our side, to hear Section 230 immediately, you're going 1996. But that's the law, right? So
and people don't realize that. Like I think if people were like, hey, like, we could have, to give like a similar scale of magnitude, if it's like, imagine our roads were still governed by laws from the 70s.
Right.
In the 70s, you could drink quite a lot and still drive.
True.
Right. It's kind of like that, where like the technology has changed, the circumstances have changed. In the United States, we haven't passed a law in almost 30 years now.
Unbelievable. Europe has. We'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
So Facebook. So this is the part where you always try to think about follow the lines here. So you interview for this job with the civil integrity department doesn't exactly match up with what you've done before. it was a job that
It's in safety for sure.
right
Yeah.
right it's in safety. And you talked later about looking back, like, oh, there's some red flags here. They weren't hiring internally. This job sat vacant for a long time. Maybe there were some signals here that this wasn't going to be the best spot for you. Can you talk about
I didn't know that context. Yeah.
Yeah. Why were you interested in that job? Why did you ultimately decide to interview for that job? Yeah.
So when I was relearning to walk, right, like it's this very vulnerable time in my life. It's very hard, right? Like, you know, you don't get sat down in college and say like, hey, one day you might need to relearn to walk. This is how you're going to do it.
Yeah.
And the way our medical system is set up is we don't really do wraparound care, right? Like I would have really benefited from like a coach that would have said, hey, like you're going through this experience. Like if you were you know, God forbid you got diagnosed with cancer, we now know like you need to have like basically a Sherpa who's going to lead you on your quest. There's not a lot of 29-year-olds that relearn to walk. So I'm kind of piecing it together the best I can, you know, as a blind person leading the blind. And this person comes into my life who is a friend of my younger brother. So they had been living together at this hacker house. So it's called Hacklantis. It's like
very Silicon Valley.
Oh yeah, it's very Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
It's in like a very rough neighborhood in San Francisco. It's literally a warehouse that someone like put up a bunch of bunk beds in. Right, it's like maybe 3 rooms. There's like a bathroom, a big room with a bunch of bunk beds, and like maybe a little smaller room. He was like a kind of lost maybe 23-year-old who had come to San Francisco to make his way in the world. And I hired him to be an assistant when I needed to clean out a storage unit. So I had a storage closet in my building. I was weak enough that I could either haul the boxes into my apartment and then haul whatever was left over to the trash, or I could go through the boxes. Like I was not going to be able to do all of them. And so he allowed me to be able to sit on the couch and go through boxes and triage all this stuff. And he would carry things for me, right? Because that's kind of the level I was at. And we became really good friends. And I kept hiring for more odd jobs. And at some point, like he needed an office, right? So he was living in like the reality of the Bay Area. We have no housing. So he was living in like a garage in Berkeley. Like people literally build big plywood boxes and put them in their garages and then rent them because it's barbaric.
Is this Jonah?
This is Jonah. Yeah. And this could be like an offside for the like not in thing. So I intentionally changed the names, and it's really hard for me sometimes to like tell the stories and maintain privacy.
Yes.
So Jonah was living in one of these like horrible housing situations, and I'm a big sister, right? Like I look out for my younger brother. Jonah kind of took on the status of like our third brother, you know, like the one that we never got to have. And I was like, I'm not home like 10 or 12 hours a day. You know, like I have to commute into San Francisco from the East Bay. I have to commute back. My apartment is not being used. Please don't sit in a box in a garage all day. Like if you can give me 20 hours of assistance work a month, you can have this as like an office. Like no one's gonna use it. And so he came into my life as like a really important part of my team in terms of getting better. And I by the time he left my life, it was really hard for me because I felt like I owed the life I had, and I still feel this way today. To the fact that he walked beside me while I was going through all this.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. Like literally, part of relearning to walk is you have to go on long walks. And instead of having to go for a long walk in the dark by myself every night, like he would often go with me, right? Which meant I walked more, right? All these things in my life happened faster because he could be like, I went grocery shopping for you. Here's nutritious food. Or we're going to go for a walk. And I know you're tired from work, but it doesn't matter. We're going to go for a walk. And he left my life because after Bernie Sanders lost the primaries in 2016, he felt really vested in that campaign. He felt like it was speaking to people like him who, you know, were trying to figure out how to have a place in the world, but were struggling in the modern economy. And he turned to places on the internet to commiserate that also introduced him to a lot of conspiratorial thinking, a lot of kind of fatalism about the world. And by the time the 2016 election rolled around, like, we were arguing over things like, does George Soros run the world economy? Wow. Which is like a very cliche conspiracy theory. And the moment I realized I had lost him to, you know, these forces on the internet, was I sent him like a long fact-checked response to one of these things he had said to me. And, you know, because he was talking about how, like, George Soros is dangerous. He funds violent revolutionaries. And I was saying things like, you know, he helped support the Rose Revolution in Romania, or maybe it's Bulgaria, I don't remember which one, which is literally people were standing in public squares with roses. Like, I don't think that's violent revolutions, right? And he said back to me, he's like, do you even check your own citations? These are all from the mainstream media.
Oh, yes. Right.
And the thing that was shocking for me about this was, it was like, if we can't agree on the facts to then build a consensus view of what is reality, how do we even start that conversation? And that was the moment where I was like, I don't have the tools to bring him back. You know, I can listen, but if we can't agree on, like, how to even begin talking, like, you know, I'm not the right person anymore. And so when Facebook reached out and was like, hey, do you want to work at Facebook? I was pretty flippant with them, because, like, I didn't really care if they offered me a job. This is like late 2018, early 2019. I was like, the only thing I would work on Facebook is misinformation. Wow. Because during that time period where I was watching Jonah struggle, I was working on ranking, like, the algorithms behind Pinterest and all the problems that we were having with algorithms. And then I'd look at the Facebook product and I'd be like, what are you doing? Like, you clearly have this problem that we're experiencing at Pinterest, but in a different context. You're having it here with, like, how you recommend follow-up stories. So you put a like on this reasonable story, we're going to show you something very, very extreme that's related to it. So, for example, you click on a story about the election, and the box under it now has a story saying Pope endorses Donald Trump. Right? Like, they clearly have not thought about people abusing this system.
Wow. You know, as you're telling the story, I can't help but think of people I know who have kind of fallen down that similar path of you know, being in an echo chamber that then becomes a more toxic echo chamber, and then you lose them as friends. Right?
A big part of what allows me to, like, do the work that I do is, like, I think about things in terms of like estrangement, right? That like the thing we should strive for is connection and oneness and unity. You know, the connection, like, that's what humans love, is connection. And we are facing forces that drive people into isolation and alienation and estrangement. And so, like, it is easy to fight long-term fights when you're fighting out of care and love. It's very hard to do long-term fights when you're fighting out of anger and hatred.
So this job hits you at a good time because of your experience with Jonah. Can you talk about what your responsibilities were as you come into Facebook?
So this is another, like, I look at this and I was like, God, I did not vet this enough. So I came in and I had assumptions about what the job would be. Because things were chaotic enough, I asked to meet with the engineering manager I would work with, because I would usually be the person who would frame your job for you. That person had not been hired yet. And so I thought I was talking to that person's manager. I was actually talking to their manager's manager. My manager, the person who would manage me, was too busy and was not available. And so I came in with an assumption about what the job would be, which was, I thought I was going to work on the U.S. 2020 election. I show up and I find out, actually, no, you're going to work on all misinformation that is beyond third-party fact-checking.
Can you talk about third-party fact checkers?
So one of the things that got hurled at me, or, like, if you look online, like, what people accuse me of is, she's the one that censored Hunter Biden's laptop.
I've seen that.
Like, that's like one of the allegations. And what I find so funny about this is, so the process that decided we're going to take this down is something called third-party fact checking. So they hired journalists to, they give them access to a console that lets them see the most popular stories or things that are like taking off. And they let journalists decide which ones they're going to go research and then make a little correction and say, hey, this is partially true, this is true, this is false. Things like the Hunter Biden laptop would have been under the purview of the original misinformation team, or like the core misinformation team. My team, so that team is like 40 people. They run that whole system.
Similar name. Right.
You can see why people get confused.
Yep.
My team has maybe 4 or 5 people. It's the civic misinformation team. And we've been tasked with misinformation everywhere in the world that is not touched by the third-party fact-checking system. And the part that is, at the first place is like, oh, whatever, you're doing this little other thing. No. Third-party fact-checking basically only touched the United States, and even then, maybe a couple hundred stories only touched the United States, and even then, only maybe a couple hundred stories a month. Some in Europe, a scattering elsewhere in the world. But in reality, maybe 4 billion of Facebook's users were not covered by third-party fact-checking.
So we're going to get a little bit in the weeds here on, so Facebook took off around the world for some places based on this free basic. Can you talk about how that rolled out and why that was important? Yeah.
So I think one of the most important things that I'm always trying to repeat, because like I came forward because of issues around how Facebook operates in places that are not the United States. One of the things that's hard for people who can speak English to understand is the English version of Facebook is the safest, cleanest, most groomed part of Facebook in the world. But people who speak English only make up 9% of Facebook users.
Wow, 9%.
Yeah. And so when you look at other places, like let's say we go to African countries, let's say we go to Southeast Asia, Facebook surveyed the world and said, we became Facebook because we killed MySpace. And MySpace became MySpace because they killed Friendster. There are, like even when Google Plus was being worked on, there were still pockets around the world, little spots where the dominant social media platform in that country, like Korea, India, Brazil, was not Facebook, right? They looked around the world and said, the place where the thing that kills us comes from could be one of these corners of the world. So we're going to go in there and say, hey, we noticed data is extremely expensive for you. It might be as high as like $65 or $100 a gigabyte back in 2014, right? In countries where the average person makes $300 a month, right? And they said, hey, if you want to use Facebook, like a simplified version of Facebook, or WhatsApp, your data will be free. If you want to use anything else on the open internet beyond a couple other sites like Wikipedia, you're going to pay for it yourself. And what ended up happening was network effects began to form. So just like how, we don't have 2 telephone systems. You don't have like a telephone number here and a telephone number here. We have one telephone system. In a lot of these countries, the version of the internet that everyone could access was Facebook. So if you made your own website, now you were on the internet that not everyone can access. But if you made a Facebook page, everyone could access that. And so Facebook became the internet for a couple billion people in the world at least. And even as fewer and fewer people use Facebook in the United States or in Europe, those places still have lock-in because it is the internet in those places, even today.
Fascinating. So you're now looking at these other countries that have huge usage levels.
Or languages that just aren't English. Like if you're in the United States.
The 81 or 91% that don't speak English.
If you're in any but maybe 10 or 15 languages at that point, if you speak any other language in the world, and remember there's 4,000 or 5,000 languages in the world. If you're even in the United States and you speak Urdu, if you speak Farsi, you're not getting any misinformation screening, right?
Right.
And so we're tasked with how do you actually begin addressing those issues. And we only get to work on that problem for 3 months. Because 3 months in, they come and say, we actually have a bigger problem. So think about it. You remember, misinformation outside of third-party fact-checking has caused things like Myanmar's genocide.
Yes.
So think about the relevance of these things. We're like, hey, we're hearing all these reports about ethnic violence about, facilitating ethnic cleansing through Facebook. But we have a bigger problem. Like, think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
And that problem was, so this is now September 2019.
Elections coming up.
Yep. But the even more pressing issue is they have just caught on Facebook a Russian influence operation that is targeting African American activists, gay activists, environmentalists, and police officers. And I think the issue was, like I said before, they try to keep the English language version of Facebook as clean as possible, because we in America could vote to put up sensible guardrails, right? Think about that for a moment. And now you have Russian influence operations targeting people with guns.
Can you talk about this target marketing of a subcommunity? I forget the phrase that
I think it's called narrowcast misinformation.
Narrowcast misinformation. Why would they do that? Why are they targeting these specific subcommunities?
So think about this. Like, Facebook's strategy up until that point was, we are going to find viral misinformation.
Yeah.
So this is kind of part of, I would call it the respectability culture of Facebook. That Facebook cares more about making sure it looks good enough in general, right? The narrowcast misinformation, though, only goes to a small pocket of people. So in the case of, say, African American activists, if you target misinformation to them, either you literally send it on Messenger, or you figure out how to target their friends so their friends share it to them, or you target ads at them. There's a bunch of different ways you can do this. You find a group of activists, like a Facebook group of activists, you send it to that group. There's a lot of different techniques you can use. If you can get an activist to then share out your misinformation, the people who trust them trust it even more because it came from them.
Right.
So in the case of police officers aren't just people who carry guns. They're people who have a lot of respect in their communities as a general rule. It's not going to be universal. And if you go in there and say, hey, thin blue line, right, like during Black Lives Matter. If you put in these memes, you can create division. Or you can just make it more unstable, right? Like, if you start having, we know there is a problem in the U.S. Armed Services right now around conspiratorial thinking, like QAnon and things like that. Think about how dangerous it is to have people in your national security sector begin to believe things that are not part of consensus reality.
This is a great feature of Facebook, to be able to specifically target from a marketer standpoint for businesses, but Russia's using this for the purposes of tainting the population in the United States to drive certain agendas, right?
Well, there's other countries too, but
So
China, for example.
They gave you 2 weeks to come up with a plan to address this concern, right? Is that
the narrowcast misinformation was I guess they did it again so originally when I did civic misinformation, they gave me 2 weeks. The second time they also gave me 2 weeks.
And so a staff of hundreds.
And this is
5.
and the thing that is super frustrating about this is, think about this. This problem had been known for 4 years. Right,
Sure.
They'd known about this since 2016. They were like, oh, when we think about misinformation, these are the different facets. There was a 40-person engineering team that went, this is too complicated, we're not going to address it. And they gave our little 5-person team 2 weeks to figure out, what are you going to do about it?
So Facebook, not a bootstrap company that was hard, had cash available somewhere that could put money at this.
They had tens of billions of dollars of profit every year. They had 30% profit margins that year, I think.
So 2019,
$140 billion of revenue in that ballpark.
So.
And they couldn't find another $5 million to throw at the problem.
Why do you think they didn't do that? Why didn't they put money at this issue?
I think a huge part about this book is about. So I said before, there's the book that I wanted to write when I started out, and the book that I was like, this is the book we need now.
Yes.
Is that, and we talked about this when we talked about opaque companies. Trade-offs happen every day. And in the case of safety is a cost center, at least in the system of incentives that we have today. Like the Digital Services Act in Europe may slightly change those economics, but at least as we think about it today, safety is a cost center. And counterfactuals are very hard to prove, right? If you prevent a thing from happening, that's actually worth a huge amount of money.
Yes.
But it's very hard if you have a system that only cares about objective measurement to say, hey, we tamped down this fire before it started raging. And so underinvestment like that happens. So in the case of what we are working on, there are ways to find people who are acting in that way. It is much harder to say, this impact on society was XYZ. This is what we prevented. And so it was just not prioritized as a place that would be impactful.
At this point, so we're approaching 2020. The elections are coming. Iowa's coming in February of 2020.
The caucuses.
Were you thinking about leaving at this point? Or?
Yeah, so I came really, I felt very, very conflicted. So by the middle of December 2019, like I remember having a conversation where I was like, if I stay, am I culpable? Because we are not doing enough. Like we are, am I window dressing for like, we're doing something? But if you know that you're not actually doing enough that is meaningful, like if you stay, like are you lending to that lie, right? I was not really, and I'm also dealing with like a really, really stressful environment, which is the engineering manager they put with me. He had no background in data science or in data mining or in artificial intelligence. He had not accepted any of my offers to be like, hey, you're smart, you can ramp up in this, like let's work together. Instead, he would just like use random AI buzzwords. And because his manager was also from not that branch of engineering, so like the metaphor I use in the book is engineers are a lot like doctors. Like if you have a problem with your eye, you don't go to a podiatrist. If you have a problem with your foot, you don't go to an ophthalmologist. It doesn't mean that an ophthalmologist or a podiatrist are better or worse. They're just specialists. And my engineering manager, who was supposed to be my collaborator, my teammate, he was an expert at scalable data systems. You have 300 million people around the world who need to access your app. It needs to be up 99.99% of the year. How do you do that? That's a very hard, sophisticated thing. It is not a thing where you say, somewhere in the United States, 10 people are trying to influence a subpopulation. We're not going to tell you which one. Go find them. Right? And it had caused all sorts of conflict. It was very bad. Because like he wouldn't acknowledge that there was that difference, and he resented the fact that I was like effectively leading the team. So all these factors are like coming together, and I'm not a person who has panic attacks, right? Like a thing that I often tell people is like, so I have severe neuropathy, which means like I couldn't walk in 2014. Today I can hike for 12 hours. Because my nerves have regrown a lot, my muscles have regrown.
Good for you. Super
cool. Except for my nerves are now noisy. So because they're growing, I get a lot of phantom sensation. I have like constant pain. And so I am always on things called neuropathy medication, which slows your nerves down. Like it makes that noise less loud. And it means that I am in general very calm because like my nerves just don't fire very much anymore. Even I, well medicated with like things that make you calm, had a panic attack in December of 2029, right? Like it's that stressful. Like I've come in and like learned how different reality is from like what I thought it had been. I've tried to talk to people internally. I'm trying to like make my team work. Nothing is aligning with anything I've done in the previous 14 years of my career, right? I'm being made to feel like I'm the problem, I'm the crazy one. And I had this panic attack on New Year's Eve. And that was kind of the moment I realized, like, this is a lot harder on me than I thought it was. And so I did have thoughts about quitting at that point. But I kind of wanted to see it through to, like, let's try to, like, complete what we said we were going to work on.
Did you have hopes that, if I stay in the system, maybe I can have some positive effect?
So one of the things I talk about in the book is a thing that employees face in circumstances like this. And I think this is why a lot of really good people are at Facebook, is there's at least one person trying. If you leave, there's one less person who even knows there's a problem who's working on it in the world. That's a really hard trade-off. And a lot of people at Facebook, particularly on the civic integrity team, fell into that loop where they were like, I have to keep trying even though there aren't enough people, because I would feel guilty if I knew I wasn't trying. And it would burn out a lot of people.
I want people to buy your book. So I'm going to leave out some really cool / concerning things.
The way I always frame it to people is, if you think you don't like policy books, this is a policy book for you. Because I tell lots of fun stories, and I try to be really accessible. And I think this is such an important space of concepts that as our economy gets more and more run by these automated systems, we're going to need to have conversations about transparency.
Absolutely.
And so that's my pitch on
your book. Does it? People should read it. They should buy it, and they should pass it out to friends. Let's advance to December 2020.
Sure.
After the election. Yeah. The group that you're with, the bigger group, the Civic Integrity is being dissolved.
Yes. We're all called together in a Zoom meeting.
Talk about that. By the way, I was in the corporate world before law school. I've sat through a similar meeting, so it resonated with me. Can you talk about that meeting and what everybody was thinking as they're looking around the room weeks after perhaps the most contentious election we've ever been through?
So less than 30 days after the election happened, so this is early December 2020, we got all told very suddenly, like, hey, there's going to be a Zoom call. Like, everyone needs to be on the Zoom call. We know what this is going to be about because my manager had posted on the internal version of Facebook, which is called Workplace, a post saying, hey, here's the deal. We are being reorganized. Inside of Facebook, reorganizations happen all the time. So it's kind of like how I spent that first 3 months at Facebook working on one project, and then suddenly I'm on another project. At Facebook, you might get thrown between projects every 6 months. Like, it's very, very chaotic. And my manager said, we're being reorganized. Like, the thing that was civic integrity is not going to be there. And so we all join this Zoom, and we get told, your work has been so important, we need to integrate you into other parts of the company. And people are asking questions on this call, and it doesn't sound right, right? Like, within 6 months of that call, a huge fraction of all civic integrity had quit the company. Because, like, when Facebook does reorganizations, the way you tell, like, who won and who lost is who ends up in control. Yeah. And the people who had been the leaders of civic integrity were not taking on leadership of the teams we were being integrated into. It was we were being kind of shuffled into them.
Got it. So you go to LinkedIn. I'm guessing a lot of people are going to their LinkedIn
I'm
profile.
Sure, yeah.
Dusting off the old resume, being like, maybe see what's out there. And you come across a message. Can you talk about that?
So I'm going down through my messages because, like, I don't log into LinkedIn very often, even today. So if you message me out there, I will get to you at some point, but it may be a couple of weeks. I open up LinkedIn, and there's this message from Jeff Horowitz, and he says, the election was almost certainly hard for, I know you're in civic integrity.
Wall Street Journal reporter.
He's a Wall Street Journal reporter.
Yep.
He had done, up to that point, I think some of the best reporting in the world on Facebook. He says, hey, like, if you want to reach out and talk about anything, like, hit me up on this Signal number. And I message him, like, how do I know you are who you say you are, right? Because I've been working on counter espionage at Facebook now for a couple of months. I assume all channels are compromised, right? And he says, if you go to my Twitter handle, my Signal number is in my Twitter handle, like in my bio. I'm about to publish this story in the Wall Street Journal. Then you'll know it's me. And lo and behold, a couple hours later, this story appears in the Wall Street Journal. And I'm like, I would love to meet. I'd love to talk to you. I think there's a big opportunity here. Can we meet in person somewhere? We meet in a state park in the Oakland Hills, and I lay out a lot of what I've talked about today, like the idea that Facebook is the internet in some of the most fragile places in the world, They don't invest in safety systems because they've told the public we have to use these content moderation systems, but they haven't told people we have to rewrite those language by language by language. And in some of the most fragile places in the world, they're also the most linguistically diverse. So even when the violence was happening in Ethiopia, which was like very similar to what happened in Myanmar, you know, Ethiopia has 100 million people. There's 95 dialects. There's 6 major language families. And Facebook had any safety systems in 2 of the 6 language families. And when I say any, I mean like 2 or 3. Like they were taking out hate speech. Like they couldn't even take down misinformation because there was no third-party fact-checking, right? You know, I said, like, I'm worried that if we continue on the direction we are going, Myanmar and Ethiopia are only the first 2 chapters of a book that is going to be horrific. Because we are destabilizing some of the most fragile places in the world, and no one knows.
Yes.
And even today, like when you look at what Facebook's trying to do to make, like, say, the 2024 election okay, they've been saying things like, we're deprioritizing news. What does that mean? Like, what is a news story? What counts as a news story? Also, it's a language by language thing now. You have to actually have a thing in each language saying this is news. Right, so these problems are that it might look cleaner, it might look better in the United States right now than it did a year or 2 ago, but that doesn't mean it's better in the most fragile places in the world.
So this part of the story is where I want people to go to the book. Because what you do over the next 9-ish months of
6 months,
bringing him, you know, the documents.
And then the stories come out months later. Sure.
Is really a testament to your tenacity to make sure the story gets out and that you have the evidence to back it up.
Yes.
Right? Because there's a lot of stuff out there. What a really good whistleblower does is says, you know, here's the evidence to back up what I'm saying. And you seem to, I love the points you give to future whistleblowers about how to do it the right way.
So to be clear, as the disclaimer in the book says, this should not be construed as advice to future whistleblowers. But I do discuss things that people who are considering whistleblowing might want to think about. And a big part that I wanted to document was just, I think part of why people don't blow the whistle sometimes when they think it really needs to be done. And I got put in this spot, right? So, like, Jeff can't help me figure out how to whistleblow. Like, that's not right.
Correct. Yes.
Right. That's unethical. Special legal issues with it. He could ask me questions, and he could hope I could answer them, but he couldn't say, "Could you get me a document on this?" That kind of thing. Right. And so I had to think through really carefully. Like I think one way to think about this is, by this point in my career, I'd had multiple situations that were really serious where people just didn't believe me, right? Like I'd come out of, you know, we talked about those first 6 months at Facebook, you know, really crazy things happened between me and the engineering manager, and over again. It didn't matter how much detail I explained it in, I was not believed, right? Or even like that first time I met with Jeff and I laid out that scenario, I said, you know, it sounds crazy. Right? Like when you look at Facebook in the United States, it's like your cousin's breakfast, you know, your nephew's bar mitzvah. You know, it's not a horror, you know, landscape of horror. And I knew that if we had any chance of not having that future, it had to be unquestionable. And I think the secondary thing was I didn't want to be the story. Like I didn't want to be the person I am today. And so I was like, how do you get enough depth and enough rigor in a way that is unquestionable, even if no one can explain it to you? And so I did things like I took pictures not of just the documents, I took them of the conversations around the documents. So that no one could say, like Facebook did later, no one believed these documents. Like these are cherry picked, these are outliers. If you can see the conversation under each document, you can see people believe this was true when it was written.
Very good point, by the way. So if people are looking for attorneys, we advise them to reach out to our organization.
Strongly.
who are, a group of whistleblower attorneys who can guide them through the process.
And I can't emphasize that point enough. Like organizations like yours.
Yeah.
Can you say the name of the organization?
The Anti-Fraud Coalition.
Yeah, the Anti-Fraud Coalition.
Yeah.
It's really important to reach out to groups like the Signals Network, which is a nonprofit that helps match people, or to organizations like yours, because individual firms are not necessarily, they might seem obvious, like they might have a name like Whistleblower in the title, but they may not actually be the best fit for you. And when you reach out to an organization that can see the whole picture, they can help guide you to people who have better track records. And I think that's really important from a safety perspective.
Very true. Very, very true. So I recognize the book is not meant to be advice for future whistleblowers, but
it can be useful for people who are thinking about whistling.
I think it's a great point, yes. Yeah. And we know that people watch and listen to the show who are in your spot where you were in 2020.
One of my intentions with this book was part of, like we talked about before about how do you get a job, right? There's a bunch of other places in the book that are things that may seem obvious to a 40-year-old or a 50-year-old that are not obvious to a 23-year-old. Yes. Or even like, the stuff I talk about around being sick, we don't get manuals on how to struggle, right? Part of why I wrote the book the way I did was I wanted it to be a book that you could read with college students, right? That you could use it in a lot of different places in the classroom to talk about different topics. Yeah. Because it can't just be a book about whistleblowing. If we want to inoculate lots and lots of different kinds of students to know that they have options.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's why the book is written the way it's written.
So your story eventually led to Jeff writing this fabulous series in the Wall Street Journal. You testified in front of the Senate.
And 10 other parliaments.
And you were interviewed by 60 Minutes. And you, as you mentioned, you testified over in Europe, which led to the DSA. It
was helpful to the people who were trying to pass the DSA.
Yeah, so that languished for a long time. It's a model maybe that we may want to consider here in the United States.
I think it's a really
good
model.
Some transparency, right, that we need here.
I think one way you can think about it is like usually when people say, what would a sensible guardrail look like in the United States?
Yes.
Because Facebook has spent hundreds of millions of dollars saying the only thing you can do for safety is take down bad things. Not like how we design the system matters. What product features we have matters. Even the recent research that came out in Science. Like I'm thinking about doing my first YouTube video because like I want to do an explainer being like, here's why these papers, which people are saying are Facebook doesn't have an impact on ideology, on polarization, on these different things, well-being. This is why these papers are really badly designed.
Yeah.
Part of why the DSA is so important is the DSA gives researchers the right to independent data, right? So all of that research, all the things that there's two ways to think about regulation. Facebook has told us the only thing we can do is take down bad content. So we think of sensible guardrails would be like, oh, what can you not say online? There's a second world, which I think is a much more promising world, which says, if you want to have free market innovation, if you want people to innovate and find healthier, better ways to have social media, you have to have someone who grades the homework who is not the company. Because then we're comparing this new social network that might make you happier, that you feel safer with your kids on. The way we're assessing it is just marketing messages. Yeah. If we pass laws that say the public has the right to ask questions and get answers, because unlike a car company where we can take the car apart ourselves, we can crash test it ourselves, unless we pass laws that say we have the right to ask questions and get answers, we will not get to know what we're actually using. We don't get to consent as consumers, and we don't get to have free market innovation.
So I found this gentleman online. His name is Elon Musk.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of him. So yesterday he tweeted, Facebook is manipulating the public almost everywhere on Earth. That is why they won't open source their algorithm. That was yesterday.
Yeah.
So this is a concern that other people obviously still have about what's happening today at the company.
You know, I want to acknowledge Elon has made a lot of choices I don't necessarily agree with at Twitter. You know, I think he's very divisive. There's a lot of people who have very strong feelings about his actions. But Elon did publish the algorithm. And he did something more than just publish the algorithm, which is he published the history of the algorithm. And as someone who writes code, or if there's anyone else on your listening who writes code, you will understand how brave this is, because earlier versions of projects are bad, right? Like, he didn't just show you his homework and say, you can grade it yourself. Yeah. He said, look at how bad my homework was in the past, right? And so I think Elon has a really important point, which is that we should not have an information environment where computers are telling us what to focus on, not humans, not our friends, not our neighbors, but computers are telling us what matters, where we don't get to look at what that process is. But I think Elon needs to go one step further, or Facebook needs to go one step further, which is even the people who design the algorithms themselves don't necessarily know what the side effects are. And so we also need to demand and require them to publish outcome data. And so one of the projects that my nonprofit is working on is something called minimum viable queries. So when you have startups, you have minimum viable products. That's like the thing you shove out the door first. Minimum viable queries says, hey, let's look at the harms of social media. Let's look at the levers. So those are places we might push on to either prevent or mitigate harm. And say, what data do we need to request to get the magnitude of the harms, or to get a sense of how hard is any given lever being used? Because that lets us see, are problems getting worse or better on these platforms, and are they trying to address them?
Got it.
And so I think once we start having interfaces like that, where we say, hey, let's agree on what the minimum viable queries are, that allows us to say, okay, we can have privacy sensitive data feeds. That's things like, how many people under the age of 18, or how many people under the age of 14 are online after midnight, or midnight 1, 2, 3 a.m.
Right.
Because sleep deprivation is probably one of the single biggest harms of social media.
For sure.
And it lives with kids for the rest of their lives. You know, there's little things like that where we can come in and say, no one's privacy is violated by you telling us how many kids are online after 2 a.m. But it does matter from the perspective of, are kids actually consenting to use these products? Right. Or are you valuing their well-being and futures?
As a father of 2 children, that resonates for sure. Here's a quote that I came across. When we choose to live in the truth, we make space for other people to step into the light as well. It's your quote. I love that quote. And I hope that today's episode inspires other people to step into the light as well. And I really appreciate you taking time with us today. I think this is the record for the longest episode we've ever had. I think people are really going to enjoy it, but I really appreciate you taking time with
pleasure.
us.
Happy to be here.
So until the next episode of Fraud in America, if you see something, say something, and when that doesn't work, make sure you do something.
If you believe you have witnessed fraud against the government or fraud on the financial markets, we encourage you to visit our website at taf.org, where you will find a directory of member attorneys who represent whistleblowers across the country. On our website, you will also find additional information about our nation's various whistleblower laws and programs, and a way to donate to our organization as we step forward in spreading information about whistleblower programs. This episode was edited and produced by Rachel Brooks, and our theme song is by Connor Chaos. A big thank you to our TAF staff and researchers of James King, Emma Bass, Jackie DeMar, Kate Scanlon, Max Boldman. Fraud in America is a project of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. The opinions expressed on today's show belong solely to the guest and are not necessarily endorsed by the organization. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Fraud in America.